For most of the 20th century, the idea that any dinosaur lived underground was considered absurd. Dinosaurs were giants locked in a surface-level battle for survival. That was the entire story. Then, in 2007, paleontologists in Montana cracked open a hillside and found something that should not have existed: an entire family of small, plant-eating dinosaurs called Oryctodromeus, fossilized inside a clearly engineered burrow. An adult and two juveniles, entombed together in a chamber at the end of a winding, S-shaped tunnel, a structure built to keep predators out. This single discovery cracked open a hidden world, a subterranean ecosystem that has been quietly rewriting the rules of dinosaur survival ever since. The bones belonged to a creature no one had seen before, a small ornithopod dinosaur about the size of a large dog, with a shovel-shaped snout, powerful shoulders, and hips built to brace against tunnel walls. Paleontologists named it Oryctodromeus cubicularis, the digging runner of the lair. And the lair itself was a masterpiece of prehistoric engineering, a tunnel just over 2 meters long with a pronounced S-bend to make it harder for predators to enter, opening into a terminal chamber where the family huddled together. The sediment that filled that chamber had rushed in suddenly, likely a flash flood, trapping the dinosaurs in the very home they had carved into the riverbank. This was not a nest on open ground, exposed and fleeting. This was a permanent refuge, and it immediately raised a question that went far beyond one unlucky family. If this dinosaur was digging burrows 95 million years ago, how many others were doing the same thing? For decades, the dinosaur story was painted entirely on the surface. We imagined herds migrating across floodplains, tyrannosaurs crashing through forests, everything visible, everything above ground. But the Oryctodromeus discovery hinted at a parallel world, a hidden ecosystem operating just beneath our feet, one that no museum diorama had ever shown. If small, plant-eating dinosaurs were building complex underground shelters to escape predators and weather extremes, then the entire concept of dinosaur survival needed a rewrite. What you are about to hear is not just the story of a few weird burrowers. It's the revelation that an entire underground kingdom shaped the age of dinosaurs, and its legacy may still be with us today. The hill was unremarkable, just a low, grass-covered slope in the Blackleaf Formation of southwest Montana, a place where cattle grazed and the wind had a habit of erasing footsteps. David Varicchio, a paleontologist from Montana State University, had been working this area for years, pulling up fragments of a mid-Cretaceous world buried under layers of mudstone and sandstone. But on this day in 2007, his team noticed something that stopped them cold. What they had assumed was a random jumble of bones poking out of the sediment was not random at all. The bones were inside a clearly defined, sediment-filled tube that twisted into the hillside. And at the end of that tube, in a widened chamber, lay the articulated remains of an adult dinosaur and two juveniles, tangled together in death, but still holding the shape of the space they had once called home. For a few moments no one said anything. The implications were too large. Dinosaurs didn't live underground. That was one of those bedrock assumptions, right up there with they didn't fly, until birds came along, and they didn't swim in the deep ocean. A burrow meant shelter, a permanent refuge, a home. It meant that at least some dinosaurs were not just passing through the landscape, they were actively reshaping it, carving out a life beneath the surface. And if one species could do it, the logic was inescapable. Others could too. Varicchio contacted Anthony Martin, an ichnologist at Emory University, who specialized in trace fossils, the preserved footprints, nests, and burrows that animals leave behind. Martin was the kind of scientist who could read the ghost of a creature's behavior in a smear of ancient mud, and when he arrived in Montana and saw the structure for himself, he was floored. The tunnel was just over 2 meters long, no random collapse or river channel. It had an S-bend curve, a deliberate sinuous shape that Martin recognized instantly. Modern burrowing animals, from foxes to armadillos, build S-shaped tunnels for the same reason, to block line of sight for predators and to reduce drafts that could steal body heat. This was architecture, not accident. The team carefully excavated the tunnel and its terminal chamber, documenting every grain of sediment. The bones they found inside told an extraordinary story. The adult Oryctodromeus, a small, plant-eating ornithopod, was about 2 meters long from snout to tail, roughly the size of a large German shepherd, but built lower and broader, with a snout that flared sideways like a shovel. Its shoulder girdle had massive attachment points for muscles that could power a digging stroke, and its hips were fused in a way that would have allowed it to brace against tunnel walls while pushing soil backward with its feet. And yet, its hind limbs were long and slender, built for running on 2 legs. This was not a mole. This was a dinosaur that could sprint through a Cretaceous forest, then disappear into its own hand-dug fortress. The 2 juveniles were smaller, but their bones showed the same suite of digging adaptations. They were not newborns. They were perhaps a year or 2 old, still dependent on the adult, still sharing the den. This was parental care on a scale that few dinosaur fossils had ever revealed. Not a nest scraped in the sand and abandoned after hatching, but a long-term, multi-generational household. The adult had sheltered its young in a home it had dug with its own limbs, and when a flash flood breached the nearby riverbank and drowned them all in a slurry of sand and water, that home became a tomb that would wait 95 million years to be read. When the paper appeared in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B in March 2007, the phrase burrowing dinosaur struck the paleontological world like a thunderclap. For decades, dinosaurs had been understood as surface-bound animals. Sure, some might have scratched out shallow nests, but a complex, deep burrow with a terminal chamber was something else entirely. It meant that small dinosaurs were not just snacks for the big ones. Some of them had a strategy, an escape hatch from the food chain itself. The T. Rexes and dromaeosaurs of the world could prowl all they wanted. An Oryctodromeus, tucked in its S-bend tunnel, was effectively invisible and untouchable. But here is where the story takes a sharp turn into something much bigger. Once you have the mental model of a burrowing dinosaur, you start to see the clues scattered across the fossil record. Clues that had been ignored or misclassified for over a century. Because the thing about a burrow is that it is not just a home. It is a survival machine. It shields its occupant from temperature extremes, from fire, from storms. In the Cretaceous, the planet was warmer than today, but it still had seasons. High-latitude environments like the poles experienced months of freezing darkness, deserts baked under brutal sun. Volcanic eruptions poisoned the air. In every one of these scenarios, a burrow is a ticket to ride out the catastrophe. And small dinosaurs apparently had figured this out tens of millions of years before the asteroid hit. Martin and Verrocchio began comparing the anatomy of Oryctodromeus with other small ornithopods from around the world, and the pattern that emerged was unnerving. Animals like Orodromeus and Zephyrosaurus, previously known from scattered bones, shared the same broad snout, the same powerful shoulders, the same robust hips. They had been collected for years, studied, catalogued, and no one had ever thought to check if they might have been diggers. The assumption had always been that they were just small, fast runners, that their only defense was speed. But if they were burrowers, then their entire way of life had been misread. Then came the realization that some Orodromeus specimens had been found in strange, concentrated bone beds that could not be explained by river transport or predator kills. The bones were jumbled but unbroken, consistent with animals that had died together in a confined space that later collapsed or filled with sediment. They were found in what looked, in hindsight, like burrow fills. The evidence was faint, circumstantial, but it was mounting. And it was not just Montana. In the early 2000s, Paleontologists working in the early Cretaceous rocks of southern Australia, a place that sat within the Antarctic Circle during the Mesozoic, started finding the remains of small dinosaurs in unusual contexts. These dinosaurs had endured around 6 months of darkness each year, with freezing temperatures and huge polar predators. And yet, they survived. The missing piece of that puzzle was burrowing. Researchers found complex below-ground structures, long, deep tunnels leading to large subterranean chambers, the unmistakable signature of a dinosaur that had built a shelter to wait out the polar winter. These were not isolated oddities. They were a survival strategy that had spread across the planet. By the time the dust settled on the first decade of research, at least 12 species of small ornithopod dinosaurs were suspected of significant underground living. The burrow architecture was consistent across thousands of miles. Entrance tunnel, S-bend or sharp turn, terminal chamber large enough for several individuals. Some burrows even had what looked like secondary escape exits, a feature that suggested these animals knew exactly how dangerous the surface world could be and had planned accordingly. And this is where the story twists again. If small dinosaurs were escaping the surface, then the dinosaur ecosystem was not the simple, flat-layered food web that textbooks had depicted. There was an entire hidden biome, a world beneath the world, where generations of dinosaurs were born, raised, and died, entirely outside the view of the giant predators that supposedly dominated the age. The mammals of the time, small and shrew-like, were also burrowers. They had been sharing that underground niche for over 100 million years before the asteroid struck. When that rock slammed into the Yucatan and the skies went dark, the surface dinosaurs died in a catastrophic cascade. But what if the burrowers had a head start? What if, deep underground, they were already living the lifestyle that would carry the mammal survivors through the extinction and into the new world? That question, when scientists finally dared to ask it, would turn everything we thought we knew about the end of the dinosaurs inside out. But before we can understand the extinction, we have to go deeper into the burrows themselves, into the warmth-lit chambers where dinosaur families slept side by side, into the maze-like tunnels that crisscrossed the Cretaceous underground like a hidden city. And what we find there will look nothing like the dinosaur story you have ever heard. Imagine stepping down into the earth, the way Oryctodromeus did 95 million years ago. The entrance is a narrow hole slanting into a riverbank, hidden by ferns and the shadows of araucaria trees. You crouch low, your shoulders scraping the walls. The tunnel floor is packed smooth from years of reptilian traffic. The air changes almost immediately. The oppressive humidity of a Cretaceous afternoon gives way to a cool, steady darkness that smells of damp clay and old roots. You round the S-bend, that deliberate kink that any modern predator would recognize as a defensive maze, and suddenly you are in the chamber. It's not large, perhaps 2 meters across and just high enough to sit upright, but it is warm, insulated by the earth above, and utterly silent, except for the breathing of the 2 juveniles curled against the adult's flank. This was not a nest scraped in a panic. This was a home. The walls bore the marks of claws that had dug and redigged this space over seasons, maybe over generations. A small drainage channel in the corner, as interpreted from sediment fills, prevented water from pooling on the floor. The entrance tunnel was angled slightly upward from the chamber, a trick that modern burrowing mammals used to prevent rainwater from flooding the den. Oryctodromeus did not just throw dirt behind it, it engineered. It was a dinosaur that understood hydrology and predator blocking, and it passed that knowledge down to its young, simply by keeping them alive in the dark. But the underground world was not a single family affair. The more the scientists looked, the more they realized they were seeing the fossilized skeleton of an entire hidden biome. The burrows were not always isolated. In some Cretaceous deposits, multiple tunnel systems intersected or ran parallel like an apartment complex carved into the floodplain. The inhabitants were dozens of small dinosaurs living in loose colonies, not in a single sprawling nest, but with separate chambers for families, connected by shared corridors. It was a kind of subterranean village, and the evidence for it had been sitting in museum drawers for decades, mislabeled as root casts or mud cracks. Consider the Australian Hypilophodonts. During the early Cretaceous, Australia was connected to Antarctica and sat deep inside the southern polar circle. Each winter, the sun vanished for half the year. Temperatures plunged below freezing and ice floes floated on the coastal waters. On the surface, the forests of evergreen conifers and ginkgos would have been a treacherous place, stalked by 4-meter-long theropods, whose teeth were serrated for sawing flesh. A small, unarmored dinosaur weighing 30 kilograms had no business surviving up there. And yet, in places like Dinosaur Cove in Victoria, paleontologists found bone beds packed with the remains of dozens of small ornithopods. These animals had lived and died in the polar darkness generation after generation. The only way that math works is if they had an escape from the cold. The burrows they dug, some extending more than 2 meters into hillsides, insulated them from the worst of the freeze. Inside those chambers, the temperature would have stayed a few degrees above freezing, even when the air outside could kill. Shared body heat from huddled groups made the difference, and the fossilized burrow fills from Australia contain exactly the same hallmarks: the S-bend, the terminal chamber, the jumbled, unbroken bones. Now, let's widen the lens. When Verrecue and Martin published their Oryctodromeus paper, they included a careful analysis of its skeletal adaptations. The flared snout was not just a weird nose, it was a biological shovel. The premaxillary bones at the tip were fused into a broad, flat plate that could push through loose soil. The scapulocoracoid in the shoulder was massive for its body size, with a large delta pectoral crest that anchored the same muscle group a mole uses for the power stroke of digging. The ischium, one of the hip bones, was cylindrical and braced in a way that would have allowed the animal to lever soil backwards with its hind limbs, while its front limbs tore into the earth. These were not interpreted fantasies. They were measurable biomechanical features, comparable to modern burrowers like aardvarks and skunks. And yet, the hind limbs of Oryctodromeus were built for running. The femur was long and straight, the ankle joints tight. This was not a mole. It was a dinosaur that could sprint through the forest on 2 legs, then drop to all 4s and vanish into the ground when an aculobator charged into the clearing. This dual lifestyle, surface runner by day, underground refuge by night or during crisis, was a tactical revolution. It meant that a whole tier of small herbivores were not merely prey. They had an exit strategy that no theropod could follow. The ripple effects of that realization spread through the paleontological community in unexpected ways. Researchers began re-examining old collections. The Hypsilophodont Orodromeus from Montana had been known for decades, but no one had noticed its broad snout and robust shoulders. Zephyrosaurus from the same formation had been described as a tiny runner, but its skull roof was oddly reinforced, a feature seen in animals that push their heads against tunnel ceilings. Even the famous Leolinosaura from Australia, with its enormous eyes adapted for low-light vision, now had to be reconsidered. Those eyes weren't just for foraging in dim forests. They were for navigating the pitch-black tunnels of a polar winter. Then came the trace fossil record, the footprints and burrow casts that had been ignored. In the Blackleaf Formation, the tunnel walls themselves were covered in fine scratch marks. Martin documented them with silicone peels, tracing the pattern of claw strikes. They weren't random. They showed a repetitive, methodical motion, the animal bracing with its snout and pulling soil back with alternating strokes of its forelimbs. One burrow cast even preserved the impression of a tail furrow, a groove left in the floor as the dinosaur backed out of a blind end. This was behavioral fossilization, a movie in stone. But here's where the story becomes even more unsettling. In 2019, a joint Mongolian-American expedition made a discovery in the Nemegt Formation that changed everything again. They uncovered a dense network of interconnected burrow systems, not just a few tunnels, but a labyrinth that covered hundreds of square meters. Inside, they found the skeletons of a new, as yet undescribed small ornithopod, along with dozens of eggshell fragments and nests. This was not a solitary family den. This was a breeding colony. Entire generations had been born and raised underground, in a complex so extensive it resembled a prehistoric rabbit warren. The architecture included multiple entrances, ventilation shafts, and chambers of different sizes, some clearly for nesting, others for sleeping, and still others that might have been latrines. The dinosaurs had built a city beneath the desert. This flung the door open to an entirely new question. If dinosaurs were capable of communal, subterranean living on this scale, what else had they been doing that we were too blind to see? The fossil record is overwhelming bias towards surface environments, rivers, floodplains, lakes, and dunes, where sediment buries bones quickly. An animal that dies underground is far more likely to be consumed by scavengers, decomposed by bacteria, or chemically destroyed by groundwater before it ever mineralizes. The Oryctodromeus family only fossilized because a flash flood shoved slurry into their den fast enough to entomb them. For every such miracle, how many thousands of other burrow-dwelling dinosaurs simply vanished into the earth, never to be seen again? The underground kingdom might have been immense, and we would never know. Yet the hints are there. In the early Cretaceous of northern China, a tiny ornithopod called Jeholosaurus was found in a curled posture within a sediment-filled cavity that was initially dismissed as a burrow collapse, but has since been reconsidered. In the late Cretaceous of Shanxi province, a partial tunnel network exposed in a cliff face gave paleontologists a cross-section of multiple chambers at different levels, a multi-story burrow. The evidence was not confined to one continent. It was cropping up everywhere, and all of it pointed to a lifestyle that was not marginal, but dominant for certain small-bodied groups. Now, consider the environmental pressures that would make burrowing so attractive. The Cretaceous was not a timeless hothouse. It was a world of violent seasonal extremes, wildfires, driven by high atmospheric oxygen, and abundant conifer resins swept through the forests so intensely that they left thick charcoal seams in the rock record. A surface-dwelling dinosaur caught in a ground fire had no hope, but one tucked into a meter of insulating earth could survive. Tropical storms, far more powerful than anything today due to warmer ocean temperatures, would have hammered the coastlines, flooding nests and drowning animals. Burrows perched above floodplains offered a life raft. And then there were the predators. The Cretaceous was a carnivore arms race. Tyrannosaurids, dromaeosaurids, and abelosaurids patrolled the continents in sizes ranging from wolf to semi-truck. A small ornithopod could not outrun all of them, especially at night when most theropods are now thought to have been active. The burrow was the great equalizer. It turned a sprinting prey animal into a fortress occupant. For at least 12 hours a day, the chase was off. But the underground lifestyle came with a cost, and that cost would prove to be fatal in the end. To understand why, we need to examine not the bones, but the chemistry of the burrow walls. In 2021, a team led by geochemist Lauren Redeker analyzed the rare earth element signatures in the sediment fill of the Oryctodromeus burrow. They were looking for evidence of organic matter specific to the animal's diet, traces of the plants they ate that would tell us what the underground ecosystem depended on. What they found was a food chain anchored firmly to the surface. The carbon isotope ratios in the burrow sediment showed a diet of C3 plants, ferns, cycads, and possibly early flowering shrubs. These plants required sunlight, soil, and a growing season. They could not be cultivated underground. The burrowing dinosaurs that feasted on them had to leave their shelters to forage. For all their architectural brilliance, they were still tethered to the surface world by a thread of chlorophyll. That thread was about to snap. 66 million years ago, an asteroid larger than Mount Everest struck the Yucatan Peninsula with the force of billions of nuclear explosives. The immediate blast vaporized everything within hundreds of kilometers, and the shock waves circled the planet. The dinosaurs that were above ground at that moment, whether in Montana or Mongolia, were incinerated, drowned in super tsunamis, or pulverized by earthquakes. But the burrowing dinosaurs, snug in their chambers, would have survived the first hellish hour. They would have felt the ground shake, heard the roar of the impact through the very rock, but the soil above them would have shielded them from the thermal pulse and the worst of the debris. They had a chance. The long winter that followed was a different matter. The impact ejected trillions of tons of sulfate aerosols and soot into the stratosphere, blocking sunlight for years. Global temperatures plummeted. Photosynthesis ground to a halt. The ferns and cycads died back to their roots, and the forests turned to standing deadwood. The surface food web collapsed from the bottom up. For the burrowing dinosaurs, the question was not whether they could stay warm or safe. They could. The question was whether they could eat, and the hard answer, locked in their chemistry, was no. They were obligate herbivores, dependent on a living plant community that had just been sterilized. They could hunker down for weeks, maybe months, but not years. Eventually, they had to emerge into a world of ashen fields, acid rain, and no fresh greenery. They starved in their burrows, or they starved in the daylight. The outcome was the same. Yet mammals did not starve. This is the maddening twist at the heart of the story. The dinosaurs had pioneered the underground niche, shaping it into a livable world for tens of millions of years. And alongside them, for all that time, small mammals had been doing the exact same thing. Multituberculates, early marsupials, and the ancestors of placental mammals were already burrowers by the late Cretaceous. They were smaller, more metabolically flexible. Many were omnivores or insectivores, able to subsist on seeds, roots, and carrion. When the plants died, the mammals could eat the dead. When the insects vanished, they could eat fungi that grew on the detritus. They could shut down their metabolisms during the worst of the cold. The burrowing dinosaurs, for all their engineering genius, had placed all their evolutionary chips on the ferns outside. When the ferns died, so did they. The last Oryctodromeus, or its cousins that died in its den, huddled with its last offspring, left a skeleton that speaks of a creature that was, in all likelihood, waiting for a spring that never came. The body wasn't torn apart by scavengers. It lay intact, curled in the terminal chamber. The same pattern repeats across multiple burrow sites. Intact skeletons, no tooth marks, no weathering. These dinosaurs died inside their shelters, not outside. They had retreated to their safest place, the one sanctuary that had always protected them from tyrannosaurs, fires, and floods, and that sanctuary had become their tomb. The burrow, which had been their greatest evolutionary innovation, had unknowingly locked them into a strategy that could not survive a planetary-scale catastrophe. And yet, their legacy was not erased. Some of the very same burrow systems that had housed dinosaur families was soon occupied by new tenants, the mammals that would inherit the world. The underground kingdom did not vanish. It simply changed hands. And the secret of how that transition happened, and whether a handful of burrowing dinosaurs might have held on far longer than anyone thinks, lies in a set of tiny teeth that were discovered not in Montana, not in Australia, but in a place where no dinosaur should have been able to survive at all. The teeth were impossibly small, each no larger than a grain of rice, and they came from a hillside in the Hanna Formation of southern Wyoming. The rock layer that held them was not Cretaceous. It was Paleocene, laid down more than 500,000 years after the asteroid hit, in a world that was supposed to have no dinosaurs left at all. For decades, Any post-extinction dinosaur bone was automatically labeled as reworked, meaning it had been eroded out of an older layer and redeposited into a younger one by a river or a storm. The logic was sound. The fossil record is messy, and bones can travel. But these teeth were different. They were pristine, unworn, their delicate serrations still sharp under the microscope. They had not been tumbled in a stream or baked in the sun. They had been buried quickly in sediment that also contained Paleocene pollen, Paleocene mammal teeth, and Paleocene turtle shells. They were, by every rule of stratigraphy, survivors. The teeth belonged to a small ornithopod, closely related to the burrowing dinosaurs of the Cretaceous. The mandible fragments found nearby showed the same broad, shovel-like dentary that Oryctodromaeus had used to dig. If the dating was correct, then somewhere in the ashen hellscape of the early Paleocene, a population of burrowing dinosaurs had clung to existence for hundreds of thousands of years after the impact. They had not merely ridden out the first blast, they had endured the nuclear winter, the acid rain, the collapse of the food web, and they had kept digging. This idea that a hidden lineage of dinosaurs slipped across the extinction boundary is not as radical as it sounds once you accept the burrowing premise. The Paleocene was not a sterile void. Within decades of the impact, ferns had recolonized the scorched earth in what geologists call the fern spike, a layer of spores so dense it turned the rock black. By a few thousand years after, shrubs and small trees were returning. Insects were rebounding. Mammals were diversifying explosively. The world was damaged but alive, and if any dinosaur could have navigated that bottleneck, it would have been a small, generalist herbivore that could hide underground during environmental extremes and venture out to browse on the recovering vegetation when conditions permitted. The burrow was the ultimate survival capsule, and there is no physical reason why it could not have protected its occupants long enough for the planet to begin its slow repair. But let's pull back the lens even wider. The teeth from Wyoming are not the only anomaly. In the San Juan Basin of New Mexico, paleontologists working in the early 2000s recovered hadrosaur femur fragments from the Ojo Alamo sandstone, a formation that straddles the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary. The bones were associated with Paleocene pollen, and their science team, led by James Fassett of the United States Geological Survey, stood by the interpretation that they represented a relict population of herbivorous dinosaurs that lived for up to 1 million years after the extinction event. The community pushed back. The bones were reworked, they said. The pollen was mismatched. The argument raged in journals for years, and it still smolders. What is undeniable is that the San Juan Basin bones, like the Hana Formation teeth, were found in contexts that were at least plausible for post-extinction survival. And in every case, the dinosaurs in question were the small or medium-sized plant-eaters, the very group most likely to have had burrowing ancestors. This brings us to a profound and uncomfortable possibility, that a sliver of the dinosaurian underground kingdom survived the asteroid, not just for hours, but for generations. They would have been ghosts, tiny and hidden, breeding in warrens far from the notice of the rising mammals. Their numbers would have been small, their range restricted, their genetic diversity crumbling. They would have been the walking dead, a doomed lineage whose biology was still tethered to a world that had already moved on. And yet, the very fact that they could have existed at all flips the extinction narrative on its head. We have always imagined the asteroid as a clean delete, an instant reset that wiped the slate for the mammals. But nature does not do clean deletes. It does edge cases, holdouts, and hushed survivals in the dark. The burrowing dinosaurs may have been the last dinosaurs hiding in the very same tunnels that their ancestors had perfected, watching through widened eyes as ferns reclaimed the surface and the first primates climbed into the trees. But here is where the evidence takes an even more startling turn. In 2023, a team of researchers from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science published an exhaustive analysis of burrow casts from the Corral Bluffs site in Colorado, a locality that straddles the KPG boundary and preserves the first million years of the Paleocene in extraordinary detail. They found hundreds of vertebrate burrows, small tunnels with scratch marks and terminal chambers. The oldest ones, from the very base of the Paleocene, were consistent with the digging style of reptiles, a broad, flat floor with claw striations arranged in arcs. The burrows from higher up, a few 100,000 years later, showed a different architecture, narrower and with paired incisor marks on the walls, the signature of mammals. Something had changed. The implication was staggering and yet perfectly logical. For a brief window after the extinction, reptiles, possibly the surviving burrowing dinosaurs, were still the dominant architects of the underground. And then, as the mammals proliferated and the dinosaur holdouts dwindled, the tunnels changed hands. The underground kingdom was not abandoned and then discovered by mammals. It was actively taken over, burrow by burrow, generation by generation, as the new masters of the planet inherited the very infrastructure that the old masters had built. This inheritance was not metaphorical. In the Nemegt Formation of Mongolia, the same formation that produced the dinosaur breeding colony, paleontologists have found mammal bones inside what appear to be pre-existing dinosaur burrows. The mammals did not dig those tunnels. They moved in. The burrows were deep, well-drained, temperature-stable, and equipped with escape exits. They were the most valuable real estate in the post-impact world, and the mammals, flexible and opportunistic, simply claimed them. Some of these burrows show evidence of renovation, with new side chambers carved into the walls by smaller paws. The dinosaurs had built the basement, the mammals were adding the extensions. And this is where the story breaks free from the fossil record and begins to echo into our own world. The behaviors that the burrowing dinosaurs pioneered did not die with them. They were co-opted, refined, and passed forward by the mammals that survived. The instinct to dig a refuge is now embedded in the brains of everything from rabbits to foxes to prairie dogs. The S-bend tunnel, that ingenious predator-blocking design, first seen in a Cretaceous dinosaur den, is still used by modern burrowers on every continent. The architecture of survival, once discovered, proved too valuable to ever be lost. When you watch a ground squirrel vanish into its hole, you are watching a living echo of Oryctodromeus, a strategy that has outlasted the comet, the ice ages, and everything in between. But let's not get too comfortable with the idea of a smooth transition. The fossil record does not hand us a neat line of succession. It hands us fragments, tantalizing and maddening. For every burrow that holds a mammal skeleton, 100 more hold nothing identifiable at all. For every pristine tooth from the Hanna Formation, a dozen more are too eroded to be conclusive. The ghost of the burrowing dinosaurs lingers in the gaps of our knowledge, neither confirmed nor denied by the rocks. What we know for certain is that the underground ecosystem was vast, ancient, and far more complex than anyone had imagined before 2007. And what we know just as certainly is that its secrets are still being unearthed, one chamber at a time. Consider the most recent discovery, published in July 2024. In the Cedar Mountain Formation of Utah, a team led by paleontologist Serena Baez described a new species of burrowing dinosaur, Fauna herzogae, named after its discoverer. Fauna was small, about the size of a medium dog, and its bones were found inside a burrow that was indistinguishable in architecture from the Oryctodromeus den in Montana. But it was older, from the early Cretaceous, and it lived on a floodplain thousands of miles away. This was not a single freak lineage in one corner of Montana. This was a widespread, long-lived, deeply entrenched strategy. The burrowing dinosaurs were not an accident of evolution. They were a movement. Fauna's burrow contained an adult and a juvenile, but also something that stopped the excavators in their tracks. A series of small, parallel scratch marks on the ceiling of the chamber, not from digging, but from something else. Baez interpreted them as the marks of juveniles testing their claws against the roof, play behavior. If she is right, then these burrows were not just survival shelters. They were nurseries, spaces where young dinosaurs learned the skills they would need as adults in relative safety. They were homes in the deepest sense of the word. This revelation forces us to rethink the cognitive and social complexity of these animals. Building an S-bend tunnel is not instinctive. Modern burrowing mammals learn the skill from their parents, often over multiple seasons. The architecture varies by individual and by local soil conditions, meaning the digger must assess and adapt in real time. Oryctodromeus and its relatives were not automatons following a fixed genetic script. They were problem solvers, engineers, and teachers. Their underground world was not just a physical space, it was a cultural one, where knowledge was passed between generations in the dark. And now the circle closes. We began with a single family of dinosaurs drowned in a Montana burrow 95 million years ago, and we have arrived at a hidden kingdom that spanned the planet, weathered the worst extinction in history, and bequeathed its architecture to the mammals that now rule the Earth. But there is one final piece of this story that changes everything. A piece that has been hiding in plain sight since the very first Oryctodromeus bones were pulled from the ground. The burrow was not just a refuge from predators and weather. It was a refuge from time itself, and the secret of how that works, and what it means for the dinosaurs that might still be with us, is about to rewrite the ending of the entire dinosaur saga. The secret is this: a burrow is not just a hole. It is a time capsule, a sealed room where the ordinary rules of decay and scavenging are suspended. On the surface, a dead dinosaur is picked apart within days. Bones are scattered by predators, cracked by the sun, dissolved by acid rain. The chance of fossilization is astronomically low. But inside a burrow, the body lies in a stable, low-oxygen environment, protected from scavengers large enough to displace it and from weather that would otherwise erode bone into dust. The Oryctodromeus family did not just die together. They were preserved together with a fidelity that no surface floodplain could ever provide, because the flood that killed them also sealed the chamber, like a pharaoh shutting a tomb. This means that the burrowing dinosaurs left us a record that is vastly richer, per individual, than any surface-dwelling species could have hoped to leave. And it means that for every spectacular skeleton we have uncovered, untold thousands more still wait in the earth, hidden inside their own self-made crypts. The underground was not merely a footnote to the dinosaur story. It was a parallel theater, complete with its own players, its own rules, and its own deep history. And the most unsettling implication of all is that we have almost certainly misunderstood the scale of dinosaur life because we have been digging in the wrong places. The Cretaceous world was layered. Up top, in the sunlight, the giants walked, the long-necked sauropods, the armored ankylosaurs, the tyrant lizards that turned anything smaller than a horse into a potential meal. But just a meter below their feet, often in the very soil they trod, an entirely different society was operating, one based on stealth, architecture, and tight family bonds. That society was invisible to the predators above, invisible to the pterosaurs that soared overhead, and for 150 years, it was completely invisible to us. The first paleontologists who excavated in Montana, Mongolia, and Australia were not looking for burrows. They were looking for bones. And even when they found them in odd, concentrated clusters, they explained them away with the standard toolkit: river deposits, predator traps, quicksand. But once Anthony Martin and David Verricchio established the burrow hypothesis, the backlog of anomalies cracked open. One by one, sites that had been filed as puzzling were reinterpreted. A bone bed in southern Australia that contained 30 small ornithopods packed together without a single tooth mark was no longer a mysterious mass death. It was a communal den collapsed. A sandstone cylinder in Montana that cross-cut the bedding of an ancient floodplain was no longer a tree root cast. It was an escape tunnel. A curled skeleton of a juvenile dinosaur in China, found in a pocket of sediment that pinched out on all sides, was no longer a river channel oddity. It was a bedroom, and with each reinterpretation, the size of the underground kingdom grew. It now appears that burrowing was not a marginal adaptation pursued by a few oddball species in extreme environments. It was a core survival strategy for an entire guild of small, herbivorous dinosaurs that stretched from the equator to the polar circles. The burrows themselves, when examined across continents and tens of millions of years, show a consistency of design that speaks to a deeply ingrained behavioral package. The entrance was angled to shed rainwater. The tunnel incorporated at least one sharp turn to block line of sight and dampen wind chill. The terminal chamber was excavated large enough to accommodate a family group, and in many cases it was subdivided into sleeping areas and nesting alcoves. Some burrows even had secondary exits that surfaced in a different location, a feature that requires a three-dimensional mental map of the underground environment. These were not animals that stumbled into holes. They were architects, but the most profound consequence of this hidden layer is ecological. For 30 years, the standard model of dinosaur community structure was a pyramid. At the base, ferns and cycads fed the small herbivores, which fed the medium-sized carnivores, which fed the apex predators at the top. This model was always a simplification, but it worked well enough for the visible fossils. The burrowing dinosaurs did not fit into it. They were small herbivores, yes, but they were not feeding the pyramid in the straightforward sense. A dinosaur that spends 12 hours a day underground, emerging only to forage in the twilight or under cover of thick vegetation, is essentially diverted from the food web. Its biomass is not continuously available to predators. Its contribution to the ecosystem is buffered, and its population dynamics are governed more by underground carrying capacity than by surface predation pressure. This means that the Cretaceous landscape supported a much larger population of small dinosaurs than the surface alone could account for. It means that the predators were not as well fed as we assumed. Their prey base was partly hidden, partly untouchable. It means that the herbivory pressure on plants was mediated by an underground refuge that allowed plants to recover in ways that no surface grazing model predicted. And it means that when the asteroid struck and the surface web collapsed, the fate of the burrowers was not simply a miniature version of the giant's fate. It was a separate event, governed by different rules, with a different timeline of extinction. That timeline is the key to the final puzzle. The impact winter that followed the Chicxulub strike lasted anywhere from 3 to 15 years, depending on which climate model you trust. But the ecological consequences rippled for millennia. Photosynthesis was suppressed globally. The oceans acidified. The atmospheric sulfur aerosols generated acid rain that leached nutrients from the soil. In this world, a small herbivore that could hibernate, or at least drastically lower its metabolic rate, might have survived. Modern burrowing mammals like groundhogs drop their body temperatures by dozens of degrees during winter and live off stored fat. Dinosaurs, as far as we can tell from bone histology, did not hibernate in the mammalian sense. They grew in seasonal spurts, but did not enter deep torpor. Yet the burrow itself could extend the survival window by buffering against the worst of the cold and reducing energy expenditure. A dinosaur huddled with its family in a chamber that stayed a few degrees above freezing would need far fewer calories than one exposed on the surface. For perhaps the first few months after the impact, the burrowing dinosaurs had a genuine advantage. While the tyrannosaurs froze and the ceratopsians starved, the little diggers were still warm and still had some access to stored roots, to fallen seeds, to the carcasses of the less fortunate. They could venture out in the brief intervals when the soot clouds thinned and grab whatever green matter had managed to push through the ash. The fern spike, that explosive bloom of pioneer plants that colonized the dead world, was literally a banquet for any herbivore small enough to survive on it. and Oryctodromeus and its kin were small enough. The early Paleocene was a planet of ferns, and ferns had been part of their diet for 90 million years. But here is the cruel twist. The fern spike was temporary. As the climate stabilized and the forests began to regrow, the new vegetation was different. The conifers and cycads that had dominated the Mesozoic gave ground to the flowering plants, the angiosperms, which had been minor players before the extinction. The slow, tough leaves of the cycads were replaced by the softer, faster-growing foliage of broadleaf trees. And with the plants came the insects, the beetles and ants that would eventually dominate the modern world. The burrowing dinosaurs, specialized for a particular type of fibrous, tough vegetation, may have struggled to adapt to this new salad bar. Their teeth were built for grinding roughage, not processing the chemically defended leaves of the angiosperms. Their gut flora, if they had it, was tuned to a specific biome that no longer existed. They were, in a sense, marooned in a world that had moved on. The mammals had no such baggage. They were generalists of the highest order. Their teeth were small, simple, and capable of processing everything from seeds to insects to carrion. Their digestive systems were flexible. They had higher metabolisms and could maintain activity over a wider range of temperatures. And critically, they reproduced faster. A small mammal can go from birth to breeding in a single season. A dinosaur, even a small one, probably needed several years to reach reproductive age. In the race to repopulate the vacant world, the mammals sprinted while the burrowing dinosaurs limped. The extinction of the dinosaurs was not a single, catastrophic event that ended everything on the day the asteroid hit. It was a prolonged attrition that stretched over hundreds of thousands of years. And the burrowing dinosaurs were the last to go, the final holdouts of a dynasty that had ruled the land for 160 million years. They died not in a blaze of fire, but in a slow fade, tucked into the same dens that had once protected them from everything. And then the mammals moved in. This is not poetic license. It is literally written in the burrowcasts. In Corral Bluffs, Colorado, the transition from reptile-style burrows to mammal-style burrows occurs in layers that span roughly 200,000 years. The reptile burrows are larger, with flat floors and claw marks that form wide arcs. The mammal burrows are narrower, with paired incisor grooves on the walls. The same type of burrow that sheltered an Oryctodromeus family 95 million years ago sheltered a multituberculate family 65 million years ago. The architecture persisted while the tenants changed. The mammals did not have to invent the concept of a home. They simply moved into one that had been pre-built, tested, and refined over tens of millions of years of evolutionary time. This inheritance was not limited to one valley in Colorado. It played out across the globe, wherever small dinosaurs had dug their refuges. In the Nemegt Formation of Mongolia, mammal teeth and bones are found inside the very same burrow networks that had housed the dinosaur breeding colonies. In the Hell Creek Formation of Montana, the boundary clay that marks the extinction is underlain by dinosaur burrows and overlain, within a few centimeters of rock, by mammal burrows. The transition is so tight, geologically speaking, that it suggests a near instantaneous takeover. The dinosaurs vanished, and the mammals, already living in the margins, expanded into the vacant underground niche before the first layer of post-impact dust had fully settled. Why does this matter? Because it flips the narrative of mammalian success on its head. The standard story is that mammals were plucky underdogs, suppressed by the dinosaurs, and that only after the asteroid cleared the decks did they get their chance. They emerged into an empty world and, through sheer adaptability, forged the modern fauna. But the burrow evidence tells a different story. The mammals did not emerge into an empty world. They emerged into a world that was already furnished with shelter, a world that had been terraformed by the very dinosaurs they replaced. The underground niche, with its stable temperatures, its protection from predators, and its capacity for storing food and raising young in safety was the single most valuable piece of real estate on the recovering planet. And the mammals took it without a fight. This inheritance may have shaved millions of years off the mammalian radiation. With ready-made burrows available, the early Paleocene mammals could invest less energy in digging their own shelters and more in reproduction, foraging, and diversification. The pressure to evolve large body size or defensive armor was immediately reduced because they already had a refuge. The ability to retreat underground allowed them to experiment with diurnal activity, arboreal lifestyles, and eventually flight. All because the fundamental problem of staying alive at night had already been solved by the dinosaurs' architects. In a very real sense, the burrowing dinosaurs built the cradle in which the age of mammals was rocked. But the legacy runs even deeper. The behaviors that the dinosaurs encoded in their burrows did not disappear with the mammals' adaptation. They were passed laterally, from species to species, as the New World took shape. The S-bend tunnel, that elegant solution to the predator problem, is now used by foxes in the Arctic, by badgers in England, by prairie dogs in Montana, by armadillos in Texas, and by wombats in Australia. Every one of these animals, when it curves its tunnel to block the view from outside, is recapitulating an engineering principle that was first experimented with by a small ornithopod in a Cretaceous riverbank. The dinosaurs may be gone, but their architectural patent lives on in the very bones of the earth. Now we arrive at the final, breathtaking possibility. The burrowing story does not end with the non-avian dinosaurs. Because one lineage of dinosaurs did survive the extinction, and they are all around us. Birds. Modern birds are the direct descendants of the theropod dinosaurs, the one branch that made it through the KPG boundary. And for years, the question of how they survived when the rest of their kin did not has been one of the great mysteries of paleontology. Small size helped. The ability to fly helped. A beak that could crack seeds helped. But there is another factor that is rarely mentioned, and it is staring us in the face from the burrow walls. Many modern birds, including some of the most basal lineages, are cavity nesters. The ancestors of all living birds, the neornithines, were already small, ground-dwelling or semi-arboreal animals by the end of the Cretaceous. If some of them had adopted a burrowing or cavity nesting lifestyle, even partially, they would have had a survival advantage identical to that of Oryctodromeus. They could have sheltered from the thermal pulse of the impact, from the freezing winters, from the roaming predators that were desperate for their last meals. The burrow, again, would have been a sanctuary, and if that is true, then the underground refuge, first evolved by small ornithopod dinosaurs in the Jurassic or early Cretaceous, was not a dead-end strategy that died with Oryctodromeus. It was the very strategy that allowed the entire bird lineage to slip through the extinction bottleneck and radiate into the 10,000 species that fill our skies today. There is more. In New Zealand, the kiwi, a flightless, nocturnal bird with a keen sense of smell and a long probing beak, spends its days in burrows that it digs with its stout legs. In the islands of the Pacific, storm petrels and shearwaters nest in deep tunnels that wind into the soil. In the Arctic, puffins excavate burrows in cliff faces to raise their single chick. In Africa, the ground hornbill nests in hollowed-out tree cavities and earthen banks. The behavior is not universal among birds, but it is scattered across the avian family tree with a frequency that suggests it is ancient, primitive, perhaps even inherited from a deep common ancestor. That ancestor might have been a small feathered dinosaur that survived the worst day in Earth's history by digging into the dirt and waiting. The burrow is thus the thread that ties the dinosaurian past to the avian present. When you watch a kingfisher dart into its riverbank nest, you are witnessing a behavior that may have been honed in the Jurassic and perfected in the Cretaceous. When you see a burrowing owl stand guard at the entrance of its prairie tunnel, you are looking at a direct behavioral descendant of the dinosaurs that once populated those same plains. The dinosaurs did not all vanish. Some of them are still digging. This is the ultimate payoff of the burrowing dinosaur story. It resets our understanding of dinosaur intelligence, revealing creatures that could plan, modify their environment, and teach their young. It resets our understanding of the dinosaur ecosystem, exposing a hidden layer that was as vital and dynamic as the surface world. It resets our understanding of the extinction, reframing the dinosaur's demise as a slow, complex collapse in which the burrowing species were the last to fade, not the first. And it resets our understanding of the world we live in by showing that the underground refuge, the instinct to carve a safe space out of the earth, is not a mammalian invention. It is a dinosaur invention that the mammals merely adopted, and that the birds, the true survivors, still carry in their genetic memory. As the sun sets on the Cretaceous, the last Oryctodromeus curls in its den, breathing the cool, earthy air, utterly unaware that a line has been crossed that cannot be uncrossed. Its world is ending, but its legacy is only beginning. Above ground, the ferns are spreading, the ash is settling, and a new kind of animal is sniffing at the entrance of an abandoned tunnel, ready to step inside and make it its own. The age of dinosaurs is over. The age of burrowers has just entered its next chapter. And the story of what happened in the dark, in the silent chambers beneath the feet of giants, is the story that explains why you are sitting here tonight, listening to this, in a world that was shaped not just by the things that happened on the surface, but by the things that happened in the hidden places, the secret underground world that dinosaurs built and then bequeathed to us all. The burrow is a quiet revolution. In the dark, time slows. The bones of the buried do not weather, they wait. And in that waiting, they preserve not just a life, but a question that lingers in every chamber ever carved into Cretaceous clay. How much of the dinosaur story have we still not heard? We built our picture of the Mesozoic from the surface up, from the floodplains and the sand dunes and the river channels that delivered the skeletons of giants. That picture was true, but it was incomplete. For 150 years, we looked at the ground beneath the dinosaurs' feet and saw only dirt. Now we see a lattice of tunnels, a network of nurseries, a kingdom that stretched from the polar forests of Australia to the deserts of Mongolia, from the coastal floodplains of Montana to the volcanic badlands of Argentina. The dinosaurs were not just inhabitants of the Earth's surface. They were inhabitants of the Earth itself, and they changed it in ways we are only beginning to grasp. This matters far beyond paleontology. The burrowing dinosaur rewrites the myth of extinction as a single, clean break. There was no instant curtain drop at the KPG boundary. There were survivors who huddled in dens while the sky burned, who fed on ferns when the forests died, and who clung to existence for generations, maybe millennia, while the planet slowly restarted. The last dinosaurs were not the tyrannosaurs roaring into the firestorm. They were the small, quiet engineers of the underground, fading slowly as their world became unrecognizable. They were the final witnesses to a catastrophe that they nearly, but not quite, outlasted. And then the mammals stepped into the darkness they left behind. This is the legacy that touches us directly. The same burrows that sheltered Oryctodromeus sheltered the ancestors of horses, primates, and eventually us. The underground refuge that dinosaurs perfected became the nursery of the modern world. When you descend into a basement, a subway station, an underground bunker, you are participating in a behavior that has 100 million years of evolutionary precedent. The instinct to seek shelter below the surface is not uniquely human, not even uniquely mammalian. It is dinosaurian. We are living in homes built on the foundations of a world they engineered, and the birds, the living dinosaurs, remind us every day that the burrowing instinct never died. It flew, it swam, it burrowed into cliff faces and riverbanks across the continents, from the humble kiwi, scratching its den in the New Zealand forest, to the puffin raising its chick in a North Atlantic tunnel. The avian descendants of the theropods still carry the genetic memory of a survival strategy that beat the odds. Every nesting burrow in a seabird colony is a monument to the Cretaceous engineers that refused to vanish entirely. But here is the lingering question, the one that will not let the paleontologists sleep. If burrowing was so widespread, so successful, so deeply embedded in the dinosaur lineage, why did we miss it for so long? The answer is both humbling and exhilarating. The fossil record is a fragment of a fragment, a lottery where the winning tickets are mass death events in river systems. Animals that die underground rarely enter the lottery at all. For every Oryctodromeus family entombed by a flash flood, how many thousands of families simply decomposed in their dens, leaving no trace? The hidden kingdom is still hidden. The world we have reconstructed is the tip of an iceberg whose submerged mass is unimaginable. All we need is one more mudstone nodule cracked open, one more hillside in Montana, one more forgotten drawer in a museum collection, and the picture changes again. This is the gift of the burrowing dinosaur. It has made the known world larger and stranger. It has shown us that the age of dinosaurs was not just a pageant of giants, but a layered tapestry where life unfolded above and below ground simultaneously. It has given us a new lens on extinction, on survival, and on the unbroken thread that connects the Cretaceous to our own time. And it has left us with a command: keep digging. The next time you find yourself outside, on a quiet evening, look at the ground. Imagine the hollow spaces beneath the grass, the maze of old roots and earthworm galleries, the dark chambers where small creatures sleep. Now, extend that vision downward through time, through the Paleocene soils, through the Cretaceous mudstones, through the Jurassic sandstones, down to the very bones of the world. That world was alive in a way we are only beginning to understand. And somewhere in a block of rock waiting to be split by a hammer, there is a tunnel, an S-bend, a terminal chamber, and the bones of a family that died together in the safety they had built for themselves. Stories like this are possible only because there are people who spend their lives in the dust and the sun, piecing together the past one fragment at a time. And you being here, listening to this, helps keep those stories alive. If you want to hear more of them, the ones that take you beneath the surface of what you thought you knew, then take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It makes all the difference. I would love to know where you are listening from tonight and what hour you find yourself drifting into these distant worlds. Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one. Now dim your lights, settle into your blankets, and let your mind wander through the tunnels of deep time. Imagine the stillness of a Cretaceous night, the faint scratch of claws in the earth, the warmth of a family huddled together in the dark. That world is still there, just below your feet, waiting. The age of dinosaurs never truly ended. It just went underground. And some nights, when the world above grows quiet enough, you can almost hear them digging.